Cecilia May Villanueva, who will substitute her. Okay, let's go to the program proper. To give the welcome remarks, may I call on Dr. Paolo Bolaños, the chair of the Department of Philosophy.
Thank you, Raniel. I don't have anything prepared, so I'm just going to literally just welcome you to the talk this afternoon. So welcome to our small lecture this afternoon. We're very lucky to have a friend with us today, Professor Thomas Mical from the Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand, who's going to talk about Nomad Science into Knowledge Assemblages. Now, we've been doing Deleuze in the Department of Philosophy for quite a while now, but the relationship between Deleuze and architecture in general and urban space in particular is not something that's well discussed yet in the university. So, like I said, we're very lucky this afternoon because we have someone who will talk precisely about that topic. So, again, I just want to welcome you, and I'm very happy that you are here. Thank you very much for going out of your time. I'd like to thank also, of course, my colleagues from the Department of Philosophy, Dr. Joyce Ariola, the director of the RCCA, the Research Center for Culture, Arts, and Humanities, and also the members of RCCA. Thank you for dropping by, especially representatives from the architecture cluster. Thank you. And so, without further ado, I'll turn you again to Raniel. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Bolaños. Before Sir Mical's talk, I'll first introduce our dear speaker. Tomas Mical is the Professor of Theory in Architecture at the Auckland University of Technology. He has taught internationally in architecture and urban design studios, postgraduate and doctoral design research methods in a range of courses in media studies and culture to support the invention of futures by interlacing theory, analysis, and design. He has taught over 40 design studios and has been lecturing and researching globally. He completed his Master's of Architecture at Harvard and his Ph.D. in Architectural Theory at the Georgia Institute of Technology. Over his career, he has been a professor in the US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, China, India, Europe, and hopefully the Philippines. Recently, he has been a senior visiting fellow at the London School of Economics, a visiting scholar at the UP Diliman Third World Studies Center, visiting professor at the Technical University of Vienna, and is currently a scientific collaborator at the University of Brussels. Without further ado, please join me in welcoming our dear speaker, Professor Thomas Mical.
Thank you very much, Paolo and Raniel. This is probably my fourth trip to Manila, and each time I come, it's more and more intriguing. I'm going to try to explain to you today some of the things that have happened in my intellectual trajectory and how my curiosity around principles and philosophical analyses in Deleuze have been quite helpful in developing concepts. As we remember, Deleuze is one of the few philosophers that says the function of philosophy is to produce concepts, which is actually a very artistic way of thinking about thinking. And therefore has a deep resonance with creative aspects of design and architecture, urbanism, and related fields. And if you go to a Deleuze conference, like I do every few years, you'll notice there's just as many philosophers as artists in that camp too. So it's an interesting fertile mix to think about how thinking itself becomes an object of analysis, but also a critical tool. So I'm going to try to show you some examples of both. I do tend to talk a bit quickly. My student evaluations always tell me to speak more slowly, and I always say listen faster. So if you can't listen faster, there'll be recordings, and you're welcome to watch these, and I'm sure they'll be on YouTube. So there's the poster. If you're not here for this lecture, you're in the wrong room. Exits are at the back. Okay. Nomadology. Nomadology is something that came to me in a relatively sudden way, but was quite influential, and it's something I'm still, as a concept, as well as, I guess, a intellectual practice working through. So I'm going to share some of those insights with you. This, in a way, is about a personal application and absorption of aspects of philosophy, and not simply a clinical or critique of philosophical principles. So I was doing my master's thesis, and I started off analyzing a film, and my favorite film was Blade Runner. So I spent a lot of time studying the film and doing diagrams and analysis of this dystopian future, and looking at some of the structural formations and processes, and thinking about everything I've read about urbanism and everything I've read about media and representations of urbanism seems to either view them as images or as objects or as these autonomous and discrete processes, when in fact it's quite often the dynamic interaction and increasingly the invisible components that are just as influential. The invisible hands in urbanism, which now are quite profound and multiple. And in the process of trying to sort through my own master's thesis research, it was a chance encounter at the MIT Press bookstore that I found this little thing, which was one of those strange moments in my life where my subconscious said, pick that book up, which I did. And I started reading through it, and I said, this has nothing to do with my thesis. And then I read it all the way through, and the second time I read it, I said, this has everything to do with my thesis. And I think this is something that some of my students have told me that's happened too when they encounter Deleuze and Guattari's work, and particularly people who just plunge right into 1,000 plateaus. So I did the wise thing of starting with one component, and this was the semiotext book, which quite literally took me down a rabbit hole. All of the things I've been working on in terms of trying to understand cities as processes got jettisoned in the reading and rereading of this very important text, which ostensibly was about trying to find ways to apply some principles, some spatial principles, and I would argue some aesthetic principles, but also perhaps some ethical principles, because we know those branches of philosophy were once deeply intertwined, and looking at nomadism as it occurred in the steppes and how that is an alternative to what was increasingly a sanctioned autocratic command and control system that is called state science. And those of you who work in upper levels of university, which I've just liberated myself from as a former dean, understand that the command and control and surveillance apparatus tied to universities is increasingly tied to financial systems. The fundamental polemic of the text is quite profound, and it states that there are, in principle, an established set or a canonical set of principles around what constitutes state science, and state science often has to do with probably the closest figure I could call up would be geometry and discipline, control, precision, and working through territorializing what is left unknown, mysterious, strange, or at the margins of things. The nomad science, which is opposed to the idea of state science, and the argument is about deterritorialization, disassembling, taking apart, untangling, and in some cases transposing those things that are normally accepted standard protocols to produce something that's other. It's a creative act and it's a destructive act simultaneously, and you can hear traces of Nietzsche in some of these writings and these celebrations of the blonde beasts and the nomadics as they move through regulated structures and destabilize them. In the context of studio, probably Joseph Beuys, someone who's also very close to myself in terms of intellectual trajectory, worked through some very deep understandings and personal understandings of his experience with nomadic groups and applied that as an artistic and creative practice. But for me, perhaps the biggest legacy of Beuys was his open democratic approach towards studio, when he admitted all 800 students to Dusseldorf, for example, against the university's recommendation, and said, if you want to teach art, why should I stop you? And I think that's an important part of understanding this too, that there's not just notions of plurality or multiple lines of flight in terms of pursuits of ideas that allow you to escape from the command and control systems, but the idea that there's inherent freedom embedded in these processes that celebrate and elevate that nomadic impulse, that ability. It's not the existential desire to be elsewhere, but is actually more accurately that sense of encounter, exploration, not pillaging perhaps, but moving from discipline to discipline, territory to territory, city to city, or from lifestyle and agency to lifestyle and agency as a set of a vigorous exploration of what is possible. Now there's a resonance in the text that I don't think too many people have picked up on, but a lot of the studies of nomadism and nomadology in particular talk about the importance and the significance that Deleuze and Guattari put on metallurgy. But there's actually a corollary in architectural history, those of you that are trained in architecture. Gottfried Semper, a German architectural art historian, was the first to come up with a purely materialistic theory of architectural history. And it was quite profound and influential. It influenced everyone from Otto Wagner to Louis Sullivan and a great range of early modern architects. And Semper's argument, which resonates with the nomadology principles, was that each distinct climate produces a type of prototypical or original architecture that is based on the privileged material mode of construction within that culture. And in looking at Polynesian, which was a code word for Oceanic or Pacific, he pointed out that we often will have textiles as the space dividers and as the fundamental construction methods. It is the case also in desert environments where there's no context, and there's a lot of parallels in Deleuze and Guattari's writings about the desert and the oceanic in terms of their smoothness of their space, which I'll get back to. But Gottfried Semper was the one that said each of the 4 different climatic regions produce an original type of materialist architecture. And you can think of, Europe develops a ceramic type of architecture. And as a consequence, each of these different material modes of production guarantees a different type of spatial enclosure, which creates a different type of tectonic system, which delivers to us as a society fundamental understandings of social relationships, the institution of families, the institution of motherhood and such, through the material constructions we use repetitively and almost subconsciously using the materials at hand. And it's the materials at hand that fascinated me as a designer too, because we were always told that you're only as good as the tools that you've got. And I've heard this from musicians, I've heard it from poets, and we were just discussing research methods in philosophy. It applies to philosophy as well. Graham Harman, when he finished his dissertation on Heidegger and did his first essay, his first book, I think it was on tool being, and he was looking at the Heideggerian perspective and shifting it from that notion of being, which in early classical philosophy, pre-classical philosophy was the antithesis of the principles of becoming, and process philosophy, which I'll also look to in a minute. But the tools had a sense of being, or a sense of presence in and of themselves, distinct perhaps from their human agents. And this is a radical position that allows the development of what later came to be called object-oriented ontology. But tool being is also very important to think about as well, because you're seeing here some examples of tools used for construction and the making and the shaping of ceramics. So we have to understand that the artifacts and the materials that we make, which I would include in that group, the invisible spaces that we make and occupy. I always tell people who don't think architecture is very interesting that actually what architects design is 99% hollow, the space that we live in that's filled with oxygen and functions, and we actually are shaping our built environment in a negative or subtractive way in relationship to the enclosure systems and the material systems that we have as our tools. So you have to operate at 2 levels simultaneously. So this is something I started to explore when I was a baby professor, the actual using of tools and the making and the learning through making. And so I would do something very, very horrible to students. I would make them read Deleuzian philosophy as 2nd and 3rd year architecture students, and then to take the ideas that they understood and try to build models of those ideas, instead of sketching, jumping into physical construction. So the idea was to teach people to translate some of the most difficult and abstract notions of process or becoming or these changes of state, and how to incorporate that into a material logic that in some ways responds to scale and gravity. And you can see it led to architecture. Some would accuse it perhaps of being formalist, but the intention behind it, and I can tell you quite a few students saying, why do we need to study philosophy? And I said, because you can't think about thinking unless you have a good grounding in philosophy, and we were fortunate to have that as part of our training too. Understanding human relationships is a crucial part of designing things for humans, if you believe in human-centered design. But also understanding philosophy is very difficult to think, to change your thinking, improve your thinking, or produce greater effects unless you actually have the suppleness or the metacognitive level of being able to manipulate how you think and using tools to do that. So without a philosophy class, you're pretty much adrift in the water with no oar. And here's some examples of some student work. About 40% of people who study architecture don't do architecture when they graduate, and I actually think that's okay. It's a discipline that's itself often going through different types or different scales of identity crises and its relationships to other professions in the built environment. But it's also, in some ways, the last bastion of liberal arts education, that different things get fused together into a synthetic and creative process that's driven by students. So you can see some examples. These are projects by students a year or two after they left. Everything from fashion design to bicycle design to lighting design. And the fun thing about being a designer, grounded in philosophy, and for those of you in philosophy, I would ask you to practice designing things too, is that it gives you a much greater sense of empowerment and a much greater set of tools to change and modify the world. So let's go back to Nomad Science for a minute, because Nomad Science increasingly is the dominant mode for decisions of what constitutes as real science. And if you know, in the recent science wars that have been happening the last 10 years, even the most profound and objectively precise science can be dismissed for political reasons. So we'll come back to the politics of science in a little bit. But I want to talk about some of the pure expressions of the ideas within the original, I guess, destabilizing text that Deleuze and Guattari wrote that influenced me so much. This is a image from Stan Allen from Object to Field, where Stan Allen is tracking in his essay the movement from an early 20th century model of space to a late 20th century model of space. The earlier one might look a little bit like some of Mondrian's work, or a field of Miesian columns, and the one on the right, obviously, is a diagram of strange attractors in chaos theory. And what we're seeing here is an understanding of what, in Deleuze and Guattarian terms, would be striated space on the left and smooth space on the right. Striated space is the space of grids, capture, order, spreadsheets, chessboards, any pattern, hotels, anything that organizes people into, or things into equivalencies or tables. And Michel Foucault goes on and on about this in the order of things, about how humans always need one drawer, one category that's exceptional or extra outside of that. But the idea is basically in striated space that there's an ordering system that is articulated as a power structure through geometry. And in contrast with that, the idea of the nomad science is to destabilize that, to disavow it, in the same way that the Romans would always lay out with a Cardo Decumanus, a gridded city, when they were building an imperial city or a fortress. The nomads don't believe in any of that, and will cut traversely through those grids to achieve the goals that they seek, which is to appropriate resources and give them enough fuel to move to the next point in their itinerary, which in principle would be an endless itinerary. So what we have is two fundamental understandings of the same kind of space. One, how is it organized, or more precisely, how is its meaning structured, on the left, the striated, and the one on the right, which is actually closer to the question of what does it do, or how does it feel? And these, in many ways, I would argue, are Deleuzian principles too, because a lot of the concepts that they articulate in their research are not simply algebraic or mathematical or topological, although they're informed to some degree by that, not in the way that Alain Badiou does, but they're done in a way that starts us to actually ask, what does it mean for concepts, and how do they work, and what do they articulate? So in that principle comes the idea of the war machine. And again, this is a celebration of the nomadic modes of reappropriating gridded space or destabilizing it. We can find that in cases of tactical urbanism going back to the revolutionary 60s. This is Haus Rucker Corporation and the design for, that's in Vienna. Something very simple and tactical. It's an obstruction or installation, and it is a type of war machine in that it completely undermines the authority of the medieval core of Vienna and forces people to really change their understanding of their relationship with their body and space within the city. Also tied to this idea of nomad science, and this is Under Wasser. He's a Viennese artist who also lives in New Zealand half the year and half the year in Vienna. He passed away recently. And a reference to the idea of Stenger's cosmopolitics. So Stenger, she just retired recently, pointed out that we cannot discuss science, whether it's state science, and I would imply also nomad science, only unless we also discuss the politics around it. And the question is not always who is right, but who has the authority or the power to determine what is right, is increasingly a fertile debate and a groundswell. If we just look at the example which we see in a couple of slides about climate science. So having the scientific knowledge and having that expertise, or pursuing an alternate approach of a nomadic science where you seek to bring together varieties and alternatives of fusions of disparate elements to achieve particular goals and turn everything into speed, everything into trajectory, everything into a sense of movement, destabilizes the world but also empowers the world. Now, one of the things that is important, as I mentioned in part of my pedagogy, is to understand that the structures of thoughts are things that are man-made nowadays. To some degree, they're auto-generated and not simply given to us by our phones. But the structures of thought are something that are relevant to both architecture and philosophy. So the relationship between them is, if you think about it, often what architects will do is they'll structure spaces to provoke or to encourage certain events to happen or to recur. And that's a very theatrical model of architecture. It can be traced back to Vitruvius. And in philosophy, in many of its approaches too, looks at different structures of thought. And as I mentioned, the different branches of philosophy. Our tools allow us to understand how knowledge occurs, what produces and how knowledge has meaning, where values come from, and particularly our ethical obligations to others, again, in a very structured way. So there are some parallels in the way that structure is something taken for granted as desirable and viable within architecture and philosophy. And Deleuze-Guattari's work tends to destabilize that both in architecture and philosophy too, that the rigidity of structures, their inflexibility, their omniscience and their omnipresence is something that Nomad Science would attempt to disavow or to undermine or to challenge, particularly at the margins. We used to always talk about the burden. Everyone would always say, oh, your architectural theories are interesting, but can you prove them? And one of our arguments was actually, architecture is a profession, philosophy is a discipline, although it can be a profession. And one profound difference in that is that architects, perhaps like the early scientists, would often have to give demonstrations of phenomena even before there were fully formed theories that could explain them, whether it's gravity or electromagnetism or bad fairies contaminating the swamp. Whereas the higher standard or the more accepted state science model of proof is quite difficult. So demonstration obviously aligns to that idea of the nomad science, and so you can demonstrate interesting or curious or unexpected phenomena and make them a point of origin or start a new line of flight or a new line of discovery in terms of intellectual inquiry. So for designers, demonstration, including the process of prototyping and testing and refining, this iterative or reflexive process we use when we design things, is actually in some ways an analog to the way that thinking occurs within proper philosophy and seminars, where there's a constant also feedback system and prototyping and refining. So we have to understand that the similarities are actually often similarities in thinking processes and tools and models that we use to articulate and accomplish those thinking processes. And whether we're in one discipline or one profession, that doesn't mean that the tools of a different discipline or different profession are closed to us. If anything, architects are famous for stealing great ideas from everyone. And it was Pablo Picasso, the artist, who said, I'm a genius, I steal from everyone and nobody knows it. And this is something that many designers will aspire to as well. One methodology that is perhaps gaining in importance, particularly in urban planning, is the idea of design research, co-design, working with user groups, and trying to expand that notion of expertise, or in some ways destabilize it, to bring the designing process so it's not a service delivered to an obedient consumerist society, but it's actually something that is more co-invested in mutual success. And as the basis of that, the same thing that I was told as a young architecture student, demand evidence and think critically. You can see it here from the Queen's imperative as a fundamental attribute of fundamental research methods. Using evidence to make decisions is something that is very important, not just in scientific processes, but even in the contested science wars that are going on these days. Here's some examples of 3 different master's thesis student projects. These are the design conclusions at the end, where we often talk about design itself as a type of research, in the sense that we do the opposite of what geographers do. Geographers will often map through various techniques different phenomena as they're located in space. Architects will work in reverse from the present to the future and say what could be in those uninhabited or those unimagined spaces, and nomadically occupy them with projections of the future. One of the examples that Deleuze and Guattari use in their nomadology to explain the idea of smooth space is they refer to it often as an ocean, and they give the example of the gridded city or the prison complex, to use Foucault's idea, as an example of striated or gridded space, and oceanic space is an example of smooth space. And both New Zealand and the Philippines occupy, to some degree, the same oceanic space. This is a Western representation of the first war canoes that came out to greet the British explorers. The Maori war canoes coming out from New Zealand, Aotearoa as it's called. And here you can see the later rendering, a little more accurate in the scale and proportion of the quantity too. New Zealand was the last place in the earth colonized by people. Humans have only been there for a few centuries. And some of the first recordings here you can see Lidnar's representations of one of the Maori kings, and the other is a German map, a geographer's map of the 66 volcano cones that form the Auckland Peninsula. In the context of New Zealand, all our ecologies are oceanic ecologies. We do not think of ecology, and I'm thinking particularly in the resonance in some of Guattari's work in isolation from Deleuze, not just as the book Three Ecologies, but thinking about the relationship between psychic conditions or your psychological conditions, your social conditions, and your environmental conditions. So there's, in this notion of the smooth and striated space, there's also some opportunities for some other inventions as well. We've talked about striated, thank you, spaces as being those that occupy the grid, and smooth spaces as a different fundamental understanding of those spaces being something more like vectors or a field that you move through that changes around you while you're sitting still in immobile codes, but moving at greater and greater speeds as the ideal. They also mention a third type of space, the holy space. That is a space filled with other spaces, which in Thousand Plateaus gets represented with the Mandelbrot cube. And then there's also another version that the critic of Deleuze and Guattari, Manuel de Landa talks a lot about phase space, which I'll get to in a second as well. So smooth space, we use an example of Francis Bacon, and Deleuze wrote a book analyzing I guess the mutability of Bacon's work. And here you can see a sandstorm, and you have the, Bacon often would set up a painting by establishing a perspectival grid, minimal composition, minimal elements, and then something would break that surface or break that gridded system, something unrepresentable, in the same way that Herbert Danisch in his book The Cloud talks about in Renaissance perspective. It was always the clouds that escaped the perspectival regime and had to be painted en natural, or the way they appeared, since clouds don't actually operate in perspective the way the rest of society does. So here you also have a very fundamental distinction between the idea of the striated or structured space and the smooth space, which is destabilizing it. The best example of striated space, again, in our Western culture would come from Roman models. And here you can see is samples of ideal cities from the Renaissance and the rediscovery of that classical tradition that constitutes Renaissance humanism, and the idea that cities and societies could be ordered with strong geometry and strong compositional principles, something that I think a lot of architects actually secretly still harbor as a fantasy. In contrast with that, you can see the process, for example, of desertification, which is a clear illustration of this process of territories or striated gridded space, in many ways being turned back to a more primordial state. Here it's the blowing sands encroaching on farmlands at the edge of civilization, or to use a more artistic example, deterritorialization. This is the, if you've ever seen Marcel Duchamp's A Large Glass, it was a polemical work. This is the photograph by Man Ray of them trying to clean it. So it looks like I guess, lines in the landscape, or an ideal city with different figures around it. It's actually dust that's been accumulated on this very famous work of art, and it's taken from a point of view that you can't really tell what the original work is, and this is called dust breeding, which is an example of that idea of the grid, or the striated space itself becoming destabilized. Holy space is the one that's received less attention, although some people have pointed out that this is actually quite a fascinating contemporary, not just a postmodern condition, but a contemporary condition, and that is understanding space not simply in terms of integers or measure, but thinking them in a fractal sense or as in higher orders of mathematics. This is an example of a student's thesis project who was looking at the idea of trying to protect the wetlands outside of Boston by designing a canopy or an intervention within the wetlands that also moves across into the ocean and is something that doesn't suffocate, nor does it neither leave for exposure the natural environment of the wetlands, and it preserves it in a way that creates a space of holes. It's a carapace or sponge type of construction that fuses, I guess, the land and the water. Actually, all of the Heideggerian fourfold is all captured within this. Phase space, which comes from, again, Delanda's extrapolation, I would call it, looks at the idea of how, here I'm using the example of UN Studios, villa based on a Mobius strip, and the idea was that we actually have different functions, and instead of having a bedroom for sleeping and a kitchen for cooking. If we think about the different functions that we do and then map them as time cycles and say which events happen at which time during the day, then you can start to come up with new ways of configuring space, whether it's traditional Japanese pulling tatami mats out at night and tables out during the day, or in this house, in their endless house, it's designed to take a 24-hour cycle and to make it loop, think like a tape loop or a television loop at that time, and to configure the different functions into different spaces so they recur on irregular intervals. It's a nomadic way to think about occupying the house, and the shape and the structure of the house doesn't come from some preconceived site considerations or a gridded system. It comes from this idea of this endless flow or cycle and how to create efficiency. So the functions, in some way, it's not form following function, it's function disregarding form and creating its own alternative trajectory, something that doesn't basically sit in 3 dimensions passively. I'm going to jump through that section for a bit, because I want to talk about how you translate some of those philosophical ideas. And here we've got, in the case of New Zealand, this is a prototype taking the traditional clothing I mentioned before of the Maori and trying to interpret it into contemporary materials. So you can see a mesh chain link with rope being used as an enclosure system, and how that gets turned into an architectural proposition. And here you can see it's a shelter space that's also responding to the landscape. And so I think it's very important to understand that within the use of some of the concepts and principles in Deleuze and Guattari, that we can, in close readings, find their own genealogies and their own open up new possibilities and new worlds, but we can also find applications for them too. And some of these actually have historical references or resonances that are quite important. We take, for another example, a global practice. Those of us that work, I always tell students, if you have a really good education, you can go everywhere. I'm proof of that. I often get a chance to visit and work with colleagues that I've corresponded with for years, and particularly as we increasingly find that our doppelgangers or our missing thirds for different research groups or for design projects occur in other places. We have to develop new systems to become global. My first day as an architect, I was shocked to learn that the structural engineer was in Germany, the electrical engineer, the mechanical engineer was in England. We were in Chicago and the project was in Kuala Lumpur, and that no one on the project team had ever met or would ever meet. And this was just considered normal business in the 1990s, that we had this decentered or delocalized team practicing. Which is, part of the fantasy of globalization that was promised in the 90s about, borderless society and free movement of people and goods. It's turned out very different from that. This is just a plug for New Zealand, which is the 5th happiest country in the world, if you haven't been there. Very happy people. It's only, I think, 16-hour flight from here, so it's 6 hours to Antarctica, 16 hours from here, so it's pretty far away. And again, it has a particular ecosystem and an ethos tied to that landscape, which makes it a very interesting place. And I do see some similarities, particularly in the memory of Polynesian construction that happens in both environments. This is one of my favorite maps to show people. This is a map of the world. It's about 6 years old now. And if you look at this map of the world, you will notice that the size of the countries is being mapped based on their population, not on their political significance or their distance in Mercator projection from the equator. And you notice that the Philippines there is almost as big as Mexico and catching up with the United States. Poor little Australia and New Zealand have disappeared from the map entirely, as has Russia, curiously enough. So this is a map that's well worth studying over time to see actually where have you ever seen the drawing that circles China, India, Philippines, and Indonesia and says, 50% of the world lives in this 10% of the surface area, which shows us what the structure is. So in thinking about nomadology and thinking about how this process of movement in and through space can become something that transforms or transfigures our understanding of space entirely and gives us new modes of subjectivity, I want to touch on one of the things that has been increasingly center of attention in architecture, but also moves towards that way, and that is the idea of infrastructure. Buildings and urban spaces are dependent increasingly on their invisible infrastructures that we don't notice unless they fail. You can think of water accumulation or other things that show up in space, unexpected guests, that when infrastructures fail, or as I mentioned, teaching in classrooms when the power goes out and you're not sure when it's going to come on. We often take infrastructure for granted, but increasingly in a world that's resources are being strained, infrastructure is increasingly contingent on the spaces that are dependent on them, tethered to the infrastructures, are increasingly also rendered precarious. There's hard and soft infrastructures, and hard infrastructures are the ones that are most visible. But actually it's the soft infrastructures which align more closely with this idea of stratigraphic space. And you can think of all of the delivery systems of how things get, say, from the airport through the 7-Eleven, often rely on soft infrastructures, not hard infrastructures to accomplish. And there's a whole range of soft infrastructures that are invisible, but follow this principle of trajectories and nomadic movement as a way of supplementing the hard infrastructure, the gridded infrastructure, for example, the metro train systems. My colleagues and I were joking, nowadays at Amazon.com, if you go to their website, even if you hover your mouse for a few seconds over a commodity, one of the drones has already picked it off the shelf and has already got it in a box ready to ship to your address. So they've gone from having data sets based on your preferences to anticipating you and how long it will take you to hit the buy button based on your individual profile. And as you know from the recent American elections, from your likes on Facebook, they can determine everything from your gender to your age to your religious values. So in an age of complete transparency, it's very hard to hide anything, infrastructure or otherwise. And the big joke is, whoever imagined that the Hegelian universe would wind up into a Amazon.com algorithm which determines all of your desires before you even know what they are. But that's where we are. Soft infrastructures are increasingly fascinating to us as architects because in many ways they're not designed, but in many ways they're also the place where the striated space, or the, to use the Feb's term, the concept space that architects conceive of really fall apart in the face of what is often called the fine-grained reality of everyday life. And here's an example from a space that I found quite disorienting the first time I got lost in it, which is in Quiapo near Plaza Miranda, to the point where I was so fascinated by this experience and so in many ways disempowered as an architect of getting lost that I've written 2 journal articles, and I'll probably do more, examining all of the rich phenomena. This is what actually led me to the Third World Studies Center. Because I said, hey, let me come and talk about this space that defies any of the coded systems and knowledge that I have about how urban spaces work. And they said, sit down, young man, let us tell you about the political history of that site that you don't understand because you're seeing it as a formalist. So we started an initiation of a dialogue there about how, in many ways, our disciplinary strengths are also our disciplinary blinders. And it's very helpful to have people with other expertise at the same thing sitting next to you, or even better, sitting with you, to discuss how those things work so that we can talk about what the future might look like. One of the essays I wrote was about Mike Davis's idea of magical urbanism, which was about how Latino culture had technically decolonized or deterritorialized Los Angeles. But if you don't know anything about the history of the United States or its maps, Los Angeles used to be Mexico. And if you've seen any of those red hats that say "Make America Mexico Again," there's a strong return to the ideas of tracing the long history and the deep history of things, not simply from the last election cycle, to understand, as my colleagues in philosophy told me, Hegel is a rearview mirror. If you want to see where you're going, look in the rearview mirror and project from that. And I saw some aspects of that magical urbanism that in many ways is the mestizo culture, or the hybrid cultures of Los Angeles, the media center of the United States, manifesting themselves in this increasingly complex environment. I just got lost again walking over here through it, just anecdotally. So it warrants further analysis, and I need to talk to more experts who aren't architects to figure out why this space is so emotionally and conceptually loaded. One of the contemporary interpretations of the idea of the nomad or nomadology comes from sociology, and this is Uri, Beck, and a group of other sociologists writing in the 90s with the idea of mobilities. Now this was triggered by the development of the mobile phone and the popularity of the mobile phone. Back then, when these sociologists were working through this, it was still a giddy time where people were imagining that globalization and cosmopolitanism were going to be delivered to us and that we would live in this friction-free open market environment that was a global condition. We now realize the consequences of that in most fields. Everything from education to architecture has been transformed by some of those promises and what has and hasn't come about. And the prevalence of mobile phones, there's more mobile phones than people in the world these days, I'm told, and that's going to continue. And as a consequence, it's changed. One technological innovation has changed and transformed our understanding of mobility. In the good old days, mobility basically was a class marker. The faster you could move, the richer you were. This is a drum race. Those of you who aren't familiar with this circus event, and those of you with good eyesight will notice that what's in the sidecar? align, right? So you always want to have a little bit of unpredictability. This is, again, the nomadic science, that even in the most well-engineered racing machine, you want to leave yourself open to options and always have something that's a little bit like a random generator. Most of you will probably have a friend like that you bring to parties just because you're not sure what's going to happen. And to me, this is actually part of understanding that Deleuzian mindset about nomadism as a type of movement through space, but also as an openness to worlds that might be invisible to you, that could be revealed to you at any moment if you're careful and attentive and you're cued to their existence. This is a parody of Heidegger's claim after the World War II and the detonation of the atomic bomb, where he said all of the world is going to become a picture. And he was referring at that time to the new technology, not of the atomic bomb, but it was triggered by this. Again, it's a technological determinism, in the same way that the idea of mobilities and mobile phones will change us. And this is the idea that television would make us all consume the world as a spectacle or as an image. But increasingly, in my experience, it's kind of the world is increasingly becoming like an airplane. When I was a young professor and was invited to give my first talk somewhere else, it was very exciting to carry my own luggage onto the airplane and to basically serve my own drink and meal and stuff, and it was pretty low tech. And nowadays, when you go to the airport, you're scanned, you're probed, your bags are tagged, you're served homogenized commodities and products that are exactly the same as everyone else. And there's endless retail wherever you go, and you can't see the horizon. And like a casino, you don't know what time of day it is. So airports as building types have transformed in the process of globalization towards this, I guess you would call it cool, hyper-modern, commodified space. But we're noticing that everywhere. Most of the libraries where I spent most of my formative years trying to understand the world now are occupied by Starbucks, and if you're lucky, a photocopy machine. And we notice that this commodification, or as Rem Koolhaas, the architect, calls it junk space, creeping into even the most sacred of spaces as they become colonized into this increasingly interconnected airport network. The biggest challenge, I think, for those of us that grew up reading the English translations of Deleuze and Guattari, and NOMADOLOGY came out in press literally halfway through my thesis. And I was also, this will tell you how old I am, I was the last group of students to start our master's thesis on something called an electric typewriter. They're collector's items now. And I finished my master's thesis with this little beige box with 4 megs of RAM called a Mac. And I had to take a big student loan for it. And we were the first class that had to actually take a computer coding class to get a master's degree in architecture. So I was at that formative stage where many of the modernist principles and the late modern industrial techniques were falling to the wayside in what was then called the information age. And one of the things that's come about since then as well, and I think this is what I said is a big intellectual project, probably the most profound text to transform most disciplines in sociology, but perhaps not in architecture, was Hart and Negri's publication of Empire, what was called the Communist Manifesto for the 21st Century. And we know that Michael Hart was actually a Deleuze scholar too. And so there's a lot of continuity of thought from Deleuze and Guattari's work, almost like a baton being passed off. And that's a contentious claim. There's a lot of things in Deleuze or Deleuze and Guattari, which are two different entities that are distinct from Negri's autonomous politics or some of Hart's writings, but still within that there is a concern of certain aspects, particularly the notion of territorialization. Deterritorialization comes back into play over and over again through new vocabulary, including the idea of multitudes. When I was in Berlin, my first week in Berlin, again, I always have strange things happen to me that make me puzzle. I went to Berlin to study German modern architecture, is what I thought my Ph.D. was going to be about. It wound up being on Nietzsche's eternal recurrence, and what happens if the history of architecture is not a linear progression or a teleology following towards an inevitable utopian conclusion. But what if the history of architecture is a loopy coil like Medusa's snakeheads that have no end? That was basically what I tried to sort out in my PhD. But I was walking around in Berlin studying all these architects who had read Nietzsche, and then I just stumbled across this event. There's about 1 million people marching down the street dancing to techno music. And at a moment, I had a moment of humility and said, all the great things that I can design as an architect will never be as spectacular as this completely perverse and orchestrated event. They don't do them anymore, but it was quite fascinating. And we see a variation of that, a type of false nomadism that you can see here in Burning Man. Now, the tickets are actually more expensive than any cruise ship. In the old days, it used to be a fascinating place for artistic interventions and alternative approaches and lifestyles, and kind of a hangout place for the high-tech industry. Now it has morphed into something very different than that. It still maintains some of its fundamental principles and its the rules of peaceful coexistence are actually pretty consistent and pretty functional too, so I don't want to be too negative about Burning Man. But it's also an example of that idea of nomadism becoming something that increasingly is commercialized. And we find in design processes too that a lot of the things that used to be seen as expertise or as intellectual labor can be automated. So automation is, I guess, the biggest challenge right now we have in this idea. Everything from driverless cars to, as you can see here, the case study of a software algorithm, or a small program that designed 8 million non-identical Nutella jar labels, each a collector's item. And I've started to see these appear in different stores as well. So that's the idea of mass customization taken to an absurd length, so you can buy something that you may or may not want anyway, and it's appreciated for its aesthetic conditioning. And I mentioned that with developments of automation and automatism that I think is embedded within that, it's a surrealist principle, basically going on autopilot. We're in a state or condition now where the new sciences that are being developed to understand and to work through the world could probably benefit from a greater understanding of philosophy. And in the same way that Stenger said we can't do science without understanding politics, I would say we can't actually do design without understanding science. In today's time of what we, and others have called the new nomadology, which has to do with often marginalized or invisible groups also asserting their ability to move. And freedom of movement is highly contested. Look at the EU-British debate right now too. One of the fundamental rights of humans is constantly under threat from other forces. But one of the things that I took from Deleuze and Guattari's writings on nomadology was a new sensibility, or to be more precise, a new sense. And I'm using sense here in a very coded way, because in the logic of sense, Deleuze talks about that basic principle that, drawing from Lewis Carroll and Alice in Wonderland, and the very, very clever analysis he does in that book, that there's at least two meanings of sense. There's the sense that corresponds to what is given to us through our sensorium or our sensory apparatus, and that is sensual, is another way to think of that in English. And then also sense has to do with something that makes sense, has logical consistency. And then he points out that in Lewis Carroll that the logical sense is always subverted by the zero, the dummy figure, or that thing outside of the schema or the algebra that allows it to exist but also at the same time destabilizes it. And to think about that in terms of our own subjectivity, right? And this is what I joke around with my students. I said, your design problem that you have is going to happen throughout your life, whether it's starting, finishing, making decisions, whatever your difficulty is. That's actually, it sounds a bit Lacanian, that's your core identity, and you'll have the same recurring design experience over and over again, because that's the one thing that's excluded, or the dummy figure. Urban nomads today, increasingly, we went to a conference on invisibility studies, and people were talking about cohabitation and people with families spread out all over the world and having jobs in multiple countries. And I thought, wow, that sounds really cool. And here I am 10 years later living that experience. But they were talking about people that were forced to work in one country while their family stays in another country, simply because of the economic disparities and such, which might be the case here in some families. And the consequences of that, where you both are engaged globally but also constantly put in isolation. We also want to think about, in the condition of nomads and contemporary nomads too, how technology is often used as a tool of liberation in rhetoric, but increasingly becomes a mode of capture or a type of striated space. I'm thinking of some of the studies that I've unsuccessfully shown to my own children about how much screen time you spend with your tablet diminishes your cognitive abilities, your attention span, your overall happiness and well-being. And they're like, yeah, Dad, I'll read it after this game. The struggle is real, as they say in the United States, about understanding that relationship between the promise of technology, going back to even perhaps the Heideggerian overdetermination of technology, and thinking about it in relationship to our subjective experiences and our new subjectivities that are constantly being provoked out of these new experiences or these new technologies, often operating as a double punch. And also thinking as a designer too, how can we use these conditions given to us, less than ideal conditions, whether they're climatic fact or technological fact, how can we turn those to our advantage and make them something that is not just a useful source, but as architecture used to be, a source of wonder and delight as well. You can find that also back in Vitruvius. And to take those conditions of being part of a multitude and living in a condition of precarity precarity, or as Bhutan calls it, cognitive capitalism, where even our subconscious is constantly being financialized to develop new ways to generate profit and revenue, to keep our heads above water, and to also give us a chance to pull back from that and to actually understand where we are. And here you can see in this example, just taking a mirror and flipping it as a surface to replace the sky as a way of, again, understanding, giving us that kind of disembodied mirror stage moment of enlightenment to say, I am a free agent operating within a space that could be smooth or strided depending on my relationship to the environment, and I don't have to accept either as the norm or the given. In design schools, we increasingly are looking at other disciplines for techniques. Future scanning was the idea of looking at where future trends are taking us, but also, I guess, out of a little bit of disciplinary promiscuity, which is probably a good thing and is a more heavily loaded term than interdisciplinarity. Disciplinary borrowing is probably the more polite term of what goes on, where you will take a method or a piece from one discipline and plug it into your incomplete methodology so you can make forward progress. This is the fundamental principle, I would argue, of the nomadology principles in Deleuze-Guattari, where they take and cobble together different techniques, geometries, materials, machines, to articulate a line or to articulate a flow or trajectory towards a desired goal. And so we can see in the model of interdisciplinarity that improvisation, in India it's the Jugaad improvisation technique, but also think about it in terms of how we understand the world. The nomad is always scanning, according to Deleuze-Guattari. They're scanning for resources, they're scanning for threats, they're scanning for topography so they can find their locations. And at the same time, they're operating in a very rhizomatic way. Here you can see the idea, the illustration on the right of remote sensing, using the eye in the sky, which can read your license plates on your mopeds and tell you all about all of your buying habits in that second, or pick up one of your phone calls and call up your entire medical history. All those things, in principle, it sounds like a dystopian fantasy, but it's actually pretty much reality in most places now. But the opportunity to think about how we can scan other disciplines and how we can scan other fields of knowledge and look for useful concepts, useful models, and useful processes as a way of achieving things that are probably impossible by staying within our disciplinary burrows or our disciplinary rabbit holes. I think a lot of the future of architecture, which has always been centered on understanding and apportioning technology into human relationships. And I always joke with my engineer friends, I said, you guys aren't allowed to design buildings because you don't understand humans. And they're like, you guys don't know how to design buildings because you don't understand how important right angles are and how wacky curves are. And we go back and forth about these disciplinary biases. But I think everything from understanding how drones see space to understanding how we are data sets is an important way of understanding the transformations we've imposed on our subjectivity. And if we follow the Deleuzian principles of nomadology, which I'm offering here as a type of professional design ethic, we would assert to resist those forms of appropriation or forms of capture. And you can think of, for example, in science fiction films where they talk about people that fall off the grid or in Terminator when they disappear with blanks, people that don't quite have an identity but are still there. Very quickly, one of the reasons I'm here was to pitch the idea, and this is something I've written about a little bit, the idea of global assemblages. My position is that globalization, in many ways, the rhetoric around the benefits of globalization have only materialized or been realized for discrete classes of people in discrete places, and it hasn't been universal or universally distributed. But at the same time, there is for intellectuals, and there is for certain classes that ability to move and to operate globally. In many cases, and particularly if you have the means to acquire access to particular knowledge systems. For example, as a student or as a professor, I can go on the database at my university and get access to all of the research behind the firewall. The moment I graduate or the moment I retire, that material is lost to me and I'm lost to it. And so we have to understand that all of these are in many ways contingent, not universals or not ideals. But we can also think about it in terms of social assemblages. And this is where, in thinking through the notion of assemblage as a compositional principle, and this is where Ian Buchanan has been very good about explaining how recuperating the idea of assemblage from some of the work of, say, Delanda or Bruno Latour, let's see it purely in a mechanistic or even I would say chemical way of assembling things together to achieve something. And to take it back to its Deleuzian roots, which is closer to the idea of the dispositif or the composition. If you think of a type of music that's played by different artists, that's getting closer. And social assemblages, the way that different communities will come together to band together in a crisis or come together to celebrate a particular religious festival is going to differ from group to group, and it's going to differ from event to event within the same group. And this creates a situation that might be considered multiple, but actually is just about diversity. And in many ways, each of those is an assemblage, because it might be the same script or score you're working with, or the same, annual Christmas dinner, but each articulation of that is going to be somewhat different. And I think also, if you look at this diagram here, this is my attempt to subvert some of those command and control systems, looking at one idea from nature and another idea from organizational theory that says we do not simply have to fit within our slot, that we are capable of more when we work with others. On the left, you can see two different species of ants forming a bridge so that they can access resources, a very nomadic way of occupying space, if you think about it, because when they let go, the entire construct fails. And on the right, an idea from organizational theory, a flattened organization where different people or different groups come together for particular events or situations, and the cohesion of the group is actually in many ways constantly shifting dynamic equilibrium, or even a phase state where in certain conditions it's on, certain conditions it's off. I've got a book series called Architectural Intelligences, and part of that book series we're looking at the earlier principle of multiple intelligences. And again, not to be too biographical about it, having a great many children and seeing that they each have very different gifts and very different struggles, I've become a big fan of this idea that each of us is capable or have within us multiple intelligences, and even the different disciplines have types of intelligences embedded within. So architectural intelligence would include things like all of the formative processes, the conceptualization, how we move from schematic design into construction. All of those principles, processes, models, tools, and techniques that are necessary and implicit within the profession, malleable, they change over time, they're often being improved, but they are still consistent across time, so they give the appearance of being something that's stable, but they're always in the process of becoming. And that architectural intelligence actually talks about the whole cognitive toolkit that you need to perform architecture, which is not simply technical or spatial. Within that, we also want to understand emergent technologies, and this is something, again, we scan the future for. What is the next technology that will come about, and how in many ways can we get a hold of it before it gets a hold of us? I gave a lecture in Auckland called Cool People, Wild Spaces. So I'm just doing a little synopsis of that, where I argued that the fundamental condition of humans coming together and human-centered design was based on the idea of certain degrees of autonomy, freedom, free will, and self-direction that we assume are more or less human rights. And that spaces themselves can often go wild if they are not supported with proper infrastructure resources. They become politicized, demarcated, or sealed off, that it goes against the human nature of freedom of movement. And particularly within an age of austerity, this is a house only an architect would design. You can see it's appropriating a leftover space, which I thought was really cool till I came to Manila and realized how many different ways people appropriate space. It's like no space is wasted in this city. Everything seems to have one or more purposes as a way of understanding, the urbanism, what systems, and particularly the soft infrastructures that allow different forms of life to move in and through the city. I mentioned before that in the concept of structures, that there's always one zero figure, one empty box, or one thing that stands outside of it. And we're starting to see increasingly, even in architecture, this is Campo Beza in Spain. It's an office building, which in many ways is taking that extreme idea of the all-glass building to its logical conclusion, where the building itself disappears entirely into the implied generic function of the space. And the new senses of architecture that come about from using new technologies. This is the Lens Louvre edition by Sana in Paris. And how soft machines and the greenscaping that's happening in architecture is an important part, I think, of a lot of formative processes of education. Okay, I've just got a couple more images. So the part of the lecture is called Knowledge Assemblages, and that was the idea that everyone, when I worked in an architecture firm, they said everyone in this firm knows something you don't know, and it's your job to find out what they know so that you can get smarter. So for me, design firms were a type of learning organization. Same way in a university, everyone in this room has a set of knowledge and a form of disciplinary intelligence that is unavailable to me. So for that reason, I have great respect and curiosity about what you know, and I would hope that you would have some curiosity about this too. We also want to think about our knowledge systems as ecologies, as dynamic series or dynamic sequences that interact and have significant effects on the things around us, and this is a sculptural representation of that. So, just to wrap it up, I tried to pick a science example that was not architectural, because I know those who aren't architects probably don't like the architectural images as much. Everyone knows about the red spot on Jupiter, right? Yeah? Isn't it cool? Do you know it used to be twice as big as it is now? in my lifetime. It's gone to half its size, and it probably will be gone right about the time I am. And it's something that's visible from the Earth. It's created out of a dynamic condition that is environmentally distinct. It also goes against the movement of the rest of the planet. So in many ways, for me, the red spot is the hero, the underdog, or my idol, in the sense that it is a phenomenon or condition that is tied to a particular location and particular material condition, but also inspires us through its longevity. And you can see the satellite in front of it trying to figure out to demystify this recurring natural condition. I would argue that we are actually now in a new age of exploration. I don't believe history has come to a close. I don't believe that everything has been mapped and all that is known is all that we will ever know. Every time humanity or sciences have made the argument for closure, something has disrupted them, like quantum mechanics, and blown it wide apart. So we should learn from our experiences and keep ourselves open to that, and to think about what are the new things that we can explore. In this case of the astronaut selfies, I'm a bit sarcastic, but the idea is that actually the newest area of exploration is anything with the word neuro in front of it, and exploring ourselves in the most profoundly scientific or objective ways. And my last pitch, I mentioned to a couple of people working around aspects of doctoral education. The doctorate degree in design is actually relatively new. It comes about a decade after engineers decided to professionalize by giving doctorates in engineering. In philosophy, it's probably been there from the beginning, and I can tell you my first day as a Ph.D. student, a long time ago, they said, it says Doctor of Philosophy, not Doctor of Architecture, so you're going to read philosophy for 2 years. And I was the only one grinning when they said that of my cohort of 13 other students, because the expectation was that you were going to study the history of thinking before you get to stand on the shoulders of giants and do your own thinking. This is the painter, Hans Richter, using a squeegee to create a blurred image, which is a technique he pioneered from using photography and photographic deco effects and turning it back into the medium of painting. But on top of it, I'm just going to go very quickly, and this is my last image, this is kind of what I've been working on recently, is lecturing about 6 different ways to get the PhD, looking at Australia and New Zealand examples. Then there's a new 7th one that's come out in India I'll talk about. And the first one was the scholarly monograph. This is what my supervisor told me. He said, write 300 pages about a bad German architect and get your degree and get out of here, which I refused to do. I said, no, I want to understand how philosophy informs architecture. And he says, you'll be here 10 years. And I said, well, I'm not going anywhere. It sounds good. I said, do I get to keep reading books? He said, yeah. So that's how I got it. That's a Faustian pact that I struck a long time ago. The second one is called a professional doctorate, which is based on the idea of reflective praxis. And you can find doctor of psychology, doctor of education, sometimes doctor of design, where a practitioner who's got 30, 40 years of experience goes back and reflexively analyzes, critiques, interprets, and codifies their body of practice so that there is a nugget of wisdom produced at the end that can be passed on to the next generation. So it's a time, it's called reflective praxis for that reason, because it is a bit retrospective. The third one has emerged, and this one is gaining traction in universities a lot now because of the gamification of rankings through publications and even more through citations, and that's the PhD by prior publication. So there's 2 ways to do this one. One is, one of my colleagues, you take all of the published articles that you've done already, and then you make a sandwich. You write an introduction and conclusion, package it as an intact body of work that's dissertation level or doctoral equivalent. Send it out for review as you would any sort of PhD, defend it, and go through the final process the same as a text-based monograph PhD. The advantage of this one is that if you've already got the publications, it's relatively quick to bundle them into the PhD and get the credential. In some universities, it's greeted with some suspicion. There's a forward projecting one, which is actually quite difficult, and that is very common in some of the Australian and New Zealand universities, where you will specify 3 to 5 journal articles that you will write in the future. And the difficulty with that is you obviously have to get them up to professional standards and publish them before you complete your PhD. So in some ways it changes the dynamic. Universities do like that because they get more publications out of the students, which gives them more funding and the research accountability. But it's actually high risk for students to do that forward projecting one. The industry engaged PhD is something that I got to work on when I was in South Australia, and it's based on the Scandinavian model, where in many countries you only have 3 years to do your PhD, and your first year is doing research methods and passing your exams and getting your proposal approved. The second year you do field research, and it could be in the volcanoes of Auckland or the desert outback of Australia. But we said, what if you spent that year, instead of doing field work out in a remote location, working for an NGO, library, museum, hospital, or design firm as an embedded intelligence mobile unit within that design firm or within that agency, and studied and observed them, and then came back for your third year and wrote up ways to innovate or transform that industry based on that. The idea is you also would have one of your supervisors from that industry, and it would be the type of doctor that would be valued, if not completely funded by a professional organization, and would start to create that missing link between universities and industry. Another example I learned from the Berlage Institute, which ran in Rotterdam for quite a while, was the idea that you would have a project, say the mayor of a city would give the university a certain chunk of funding, and they would form a laboratory, and master's and PhD students would master plan the entire city, and then each of them would take on a block or one of the infrastructural projects as their individual thesis. And that's kind of the laboratory model you find in the sciences. And the one that we do a lot in New Zealand is the practice-based. So you write an abstract and exegesis, it's called. Artifact and exegesis. And so if you're a filmmaker, you would make a film and then write an exegesis, which is a mini dissertation. If you're a poet, you would write poetry and then a mini dissertation. And the exegesis is basically the same structure as a PhD, but in bonsai form. It's just smaller, but it has all the constituent parts: the literature review, the justification, the conclusions, the outcomes, the data analysis, and such. And I've just read about recently, I was just visiting in India, and they've started a new program in a business school there where you can do a PhD instead of writing a dissertation. You can do a PhD by doing a startup and getting an IT business up and running, and do that for your PhD. So they're still working out the details of that, and it's created a great deal of outrage amongst traditional scholars, as you can imagine. But in many ways, that's putting the emphasis on the idea that PhDs are supposed to be generating revenue and fixing the economy and tying into that financialization model. Anyway, so that's some of the things I'm interested in, and that's where I came from. And we're out of time, and I'm out of slides, so thank you.
Thank you, Sir Mical, for that all-inclusive and practical and comprehensive lecture. Let's now proceed to the next part of the program for the reaction. Now may I call Ms. Cecilia May Villanueva for reaction.
Thank you very much, Professor Mical, for your very enlightening presentation. Now, as I was looking at your title, I was trying to define the different terminologies that you had there. And when I looked at nomads, I correlated them with the indigenous people that we have. And in this photo, it was very colorful, so I thought of presenting it. This is the Tumanleg tribe that we have in the Ilocos region, towards the north of the Philippines. Now, one of our more prestigious architects would be Leandro Locsin. He was the one who designed the Cultural Center of the Philippines. Along with this, the first image, the one with the dome, would be his bachelor's thesis. It's actually a church, yes, where he had the ministry at the center. So he was so much focused on form that he was not able to design properly for the needs of the liturgy, the way that they need spaces also for preparation. So I was thinking about what you said earlier on invisible interactions. So that's how I kind of related it. Most of Locsin's works are very much focused on form. Now you said that there is disregard for form. Was that what you mentioned earlier? Disregarding form, and we think more about function. It was some of the things you mentioned earlier. Now, as I actually went to one of his buildings, which is the Cultural Center, the one that we have on the 4th, it was more focused on the drama of space. However, there was also activities that wherein you could see a very high driveway. So it was more designed for people who were on vehicles. So there was a disregard for people who were not that affluent. There was a side entrance where people would actually get off from the Jeep. It's a public utility vehicle that we have. And it would be not as dramatic as the ones who had their cars.
It's a class sorting system.
Yes. However, this actually is where a lot of people go jogging. So it's more challenging for them to go up the ramp. Now he did take in consideration to some of the forms that he sees in nature, like the Fugao-Rice terraces that we have. This was his example of the social services buildings in Taguig. He adopted the terraces, and there were sun decks. And this is his National Art Center in Laguna. So it was a representation that although the forms are very massive, they were also floating. Similar to what we have in the Bahay Kubo, wherein the roof seems to float. So it is a symbolism that although there is a very massive task, this would be actually something that is manageable because of the bayanihan spirit or the community spirit in helping each other out. So this Bahay Kubo is actually nomadic also because it could be transferred from one place to another. And you just have the community to help you transfer them. Now with one of our more recent national architects, Bobby Manyosa, he had innovations with materialism. And with this, he was able to produce the roofing systems made out of coconut. In fact, the picture here is actually a coconut palace. Have you been to the coconut palace? Almost all of the materials are made out of coconuts. So that's the technological innovation that he's been going through by making advances with materials using local sourced produce that we have. Now this is more recent, the one that we have with the National Museum, wherein Dominic Galicia had the Tree of Life. So instead of having the old museum building, he introduced the use of a dome that is in a way letting light in and also featuring energy efficiency. Now I really like your presentation and how you articulated on the different aspects of architecture and philosophy. So I just wanted to show you some slides that would actually feature what are the developments now in architecture in the Philippines. Thank you very much.
Okay, from architecture, let's now go to philosophy. And fortunately, I will be the one to deliver the reaction from philosophy. I hope these people from philosophy will not kill me after this. But instead of giving a very formal reaction, let me just give my insights, and later I'll give some questions to start the open forum. Of course, the concepts which Sir discussed are important delusion concepts. For example, the idea of nomadism, and according to Mical, it's the movement through spaces, and it's also the openness to virtualities. Of course, the idea of nomadism is not only discussed in the book Nomadology, but also in other books such as A Thousand Plateaus, even in Anti-Oedipus. But again, in Anti-Oedipus, nomadism is discussed in relation to desire. So for example, Deleuze and Guattari argued in Anti-Oedipus that instead of dealing with the traditional striated question of what is desire, why not deal with the question, how does desire work? Which in a way which would preface Deleuze's idea of pragmatics. No? Let's not focus on the essence of things, essence of architectures, but on how do they function and how are they formed. I also agree with the idea that, nomadism is a form of scanning, which in a way is very much related to Deleuze's notion of cartography or diagramming, which in a way in other texts is equivalent to the idea of becoming imperceptible. But then again, there's a tendency for some scholars to misinterpret Deleuze's philosophy as only espousing absolute deterritorialization. But again, in 1,000 plateaus, for instance, there are three spaces really, you know. There's created, the supple, and the holy space, which is the middle space. And I really appreciate the talk of Sir Mical because he was able to introduce the third space, which is the space located at the middle. And for Deleuze, nomadism or becoming is located at the middle. What else? Then in relation to the idea of global assemblages or globalization, of course the concept is very much relevant, especially in UST, as UST tries to become globally competitive. But the problem is, some of us miss the point of being global. The idea is that from a delusion perspective, or if you want to become faithful to the idea of becoming at the middle, then perhaps being at the middle is being a little bit nationalistic and a little bit global, than simply arguing that we must refrain from accepting other cultures, or we must wholeheartedly embrace the outside culture or the Western culture without even critically evaluating them. So becoming at the middle in relation to global assemblages or globalization is embracing part of the Western culture like the Cato 12, but even though we embrace them, we should not forget being critical about it, or we should not get tired of looking for some antagonistic spaces which can be found by practicing it. I would like to end my reaction or my talk by giving 3 questions to Sir Mical. Of course, coming from a philosophy major. Question is, the idea is, of course, the idea of nomadism is formulated in relation to the state apparatus. And of course, Deleuze and Guattari came from France, from a continent. That's why there's really an aspiration to really differentialize a continent. But the problem is, what about when you try to apply that idea of nomadism in a very nomadic space or in a very nomadic country such as the Philippines? So my question is, how to become nomadic in an archipelago or in a very nomadic organization such as the country? So for example, even though we have Manila as a center, we still have many centers. And the presence of many centers in a way would let us believe that there are no more centers. So that's my first question. Second is, in relation to nomadic design and nomadic architecture, how can you balance the idea of creating nomadic designs and architecture with the idea of preserving cultural memory? Tendency is, when we apply Deleuze and Guattari's notion of deterritorialization, there's the possibility of destroying memory. And I guess being faithful to the delusion, becoming at the middle, there will be some problematics or polemics which would emerge. So that's my second question, how to balance. And lastly is, in relation to UST, of course, UST is an assemblage. We are a square campus, like SpongeBob. We are surrounded by striated spaces, condominiums, and the condominiums also affect how we move. Even the drainage systems are affected. Within UST, the main building is at the middle, and in a way, that's the center of all spreadsheets, operations, gravity, panopticon. And also in UST, our capitalist restaurants like Starbucks, etc., etc. So my question is, how can we become nomadic in a university? Especially when you are in a university, which is another name for a panopticon, etc. So again, how to nomadize a very nomadic space or organization, how to strike a balance between cultural or nomadic design and the preservation of memory. And third is how to become nomadic in an assemblage, an striated assemblage like UST. And sir, maybe to answer the question, I'd like to go there. And after Sir Mical's answer, the floor is now open for open forum. Before giving your questions, please cite your name and your institution and make your question very brief.
Can you hear me? I understand them. The first question had to do with the understanding of nomadism within the context of the archipelago or within the decentralized organization. An easy answer, a proxy answer, and you might think a disingenuous answer, is I gave a hint in the presentation whereby in the case of New Zealand, my colleagues who are Maori explained to me many times that our culture, our civilization, our language, our understanding of space is oceanic, not land-based. And the references to the fleet in being were actually social structures that were brought to the land as the Micronesians migrated down the different archipelagos all the way to New Zealand, which was the end of that process. So as a consequence of that, I was often told that you cannot treat the architecture school or the design school as a farm. You have to think of it as a fleet. And the idea of the fleet was actually, for me, very intriguing intellectually, because it meant that each of the ships was valuable, distinct, self-organizing to some degree, and its relationship to the other ships could change constantly, but there was still that shared sense of identity and direction. And so this is what the leaders or the chiefs are responsible for, was to point out those directions as a navigation technique that was also a sign of power. But also implicit in that was the idea that the organization was loose, agile, flexible, and open and welcoming to changes, disruptions, and things that were not anticipated, unlike a lot of striated or military command control type organizations. So what I learned was there was a suppleness to the organization that came from the ethos of the landscape, which was not tied to land or geography as much as it was the oceanic condition and the fact that the environment is constantly changing, and that the navigators were so confident in their skill they could move all the way to New Zealand, confident based on the science they saw. So as a consequence of that, I think within the case of the Philippines, which to me is still fascinating, as you pointed out, is actually not an entity, but it's actually composed of multiple entities, multiple groups. I pointed out social classes, which was my Marxist training. We also could say, people of different degrees of design savvy, perhaps. In that context, if you understand the construct of, to follow the pragmatist argument that you've offered, say there is no essence to the quintessential Filipino or Philippine urban condition, but say there are things in the Philippines that are part of the Philippines, and that each thing that you introduce, each phenomenon, each entity, each concept you introduce becomes part of that ecosystem. If we shift it to more of an ecological model where there's dynamic, punctuated equilibriums, I think we get something that's actually closer and allows us to avoid the neoliberal language of market shares and forces as well, too. So it's not essence, but it's also something that's distinct to the microclimates and the cultural conditions of that particular place. And so in that argument, things leave traces or have imprints, but there is no absolute essence that you have to adhere to in sort of a blind nationalist way. The second question I was going to answer with the proxy about how do you maintain cultural traditions and memory through constantly changing environments, and I was going to use the proxy argument of language. Languages do this all the time. Languages, even in the question of whether you can identify yourself in the first person singular or not, or if the verb structures allow you to have a past tense or future tense. As we know, my son studies linguistics, so he's explaining this to me. He said, built into each language is already a model of the universe. And that is your legacy. As you learn the language you were born into, and this is a very strict, linguistic determinist model, you're born into that language, and even Mical talks about this too. As you learn that language, it already constricts and structures you as an interpolated subject, and that's all through. So, in such a way that is your worldview. It's only through learning a second language you can kind of step out of that fishbowl and start to see the world in a different way too. And that's why I say, if you get a chance to study abroad, do it. If you learn another language, do it. And if you're not sure how to start another language, start with film. Because as long as it's subtitled, you will learn another language and you will see the world differently. And there's a lot of data to show this. I'm not very linguistically skilled, but most of my children are. They have multiple citizenships in multiple languages, and they use Mandarin as their secret language that the parents don't understand. And I think this is actually a fascinating thing, because in each of those languages, there is culture, there is memory, there is a value system embedded in it too. And I think I would use that as the proxy argument. How do you build in a situation where you're using new materials? When I worked in Japan for a bit, they said, we want to create the ephemeral-like qualities of traditional Japanese architecture, which is bamboo and rice paper screens, but we have to do it out of concrete, glass, and steel. How do we do that? We focus on light and texture. And so you find analogs and you find proxies and you work through possibilities. And my third proxy, besides language and architecture, would be food. Who teaches you how to cook? In my wife's matriarchal culture, the grandma. Grandma controls the recipes and the proportions. And only if you're on the good side do you get the correct ones. And so there's a guarded knowledge through cuisine. And my wife is from Mexico, so if you want to watch like Water for Chocolate, which is about magical realism and the control of the recipes, when the mother is unhappy, everybody is unhappy. And so this is actually a third way of the continuity, is through cuisine. So I think actually you can't fight it. Your culture is already embedded in the way that you eat, in the way that you talk, and the way that you move through space. But I say we can study that, and if we study it, we can get to that metacognitive level and understand the constructedness of those, so that if we wanted to make modifications or create hybrids, we can do it without creating monsters by accident. Third question. Can you remind me of the third question?
Yeah, I'm just using USD as a microcosm.
I'm going to go draw a sponge on the site plan to see if the proportions are right. But yeah, it sounds about right. Some quick examples of that. There's a debate at the Architectural Association in London. And what they did was they said, we want to have more people join the alumni. So I was a visiting teacher there for a while in a program, and so I get to be a member of the Architectural Association. So it's a group in London that's actually an architecture school, but also a collection of architects. And it's a strong social organization that gives accredited degrees, but if they got rid of the accredited degrees, they'd still have that strong social organization. But one of the things they did, which was very controversial, got the director in a lot of trouble, was we're going to do short courses. So people who can't afford to come to London and spend a lot of time and money in London will be able to take a taster course. And so they sent out in different places. Mexico City is one that's going on right now, a couple other places. They would send out some of their instructors or alumni, so it wasn't even instructors, to do short 2-week courses and teach their method. And the Stanford D School has been doing this a lot too, teaching in Singapore and other places too. So in a sense, they morselize part of the education and then they take it on the road like an entertainer. And I saw the Royal College of Art was doing some design courses in Silicon Valley to attract potential students too. So it could be done in a very, entrepreneurial way. But also, there's a lot of universities that have their, say, for example, design students. We worked on a natural disaster when I was at Georgia Tech. A hurricane hit Florida. And so for 2 weeks, the entire architecture school worked on designing low-cost prefab housing for all the people that lost their houses in Florida, which is about 6 hours drive away. And everything had to be designed to be assembled by non-specialists and fit on a flatbed truck. So we did emergency community action projects, not for any financial gain, but because it was a good design challenge and a learning opportunity. And the other thing that you could do is, my colleagues in New Zealand found that in the Center for Santo Tomas, which is the Maori Indigenous Studies Research Center, that a lot of people couldn't come and take classes or couldn't come to the campus because of work or family obligations or caring for their elders. So what they did was they loaded a couple people and a couple of their computers and projectors, threw them into a van, and did mini courses up and down the coast. And so it was a university on wheels. And again, it was done basically because there was no financial incentive for it and no reward in terms of research accountability, but they did it because it was the right thing to do. And the idea was, they even organize events where they encourage good students in high school, please come to this weekend event and see what you can study in university. And they'll say things like, you don't have to come to our university, but if you're bright, go to a university. And just try to socialize the idea that there is a lot to be gained by a community from one person getting the investment to attend university too. So I think in terms of, the UK and other places, they're trying to measure research impact. But I think it's actually just being a good neighbor and saying, you've got all this expertise and knowledge in the university, and there's no way we would be able to turn it into a competitive business. Universities are not competitive businesses, they're learning organizations. How can you share some of that knowledge and who would benefit from it? And I think that just creates, I was mentioning to someone else before too, if you live a long life and you accumulate a lot of wealth, you really can't take it with you. So most people will wisely, find ways to distribute that wealth towards the end of their careers to the people that need it, or to other activities. And to think about that too, that you actually gain in wealth by giving things away. And the most valuable commodity we have is not money, it's time. Time is much more valuable than money. If you ask people at the end of their lives, they will tell you that. So we have to understand within a university, whether it's UST or Auckland or somewhere else, that what we spend our time on should be stuff that fulfills us, fulfills our communities, and generates those feelings of positivity. You can say, I did that, or only we could do that. And I think that's actually the challenge for thinking of how to break outside of the SpongeBob box, is what can we give back where, what's the best use of our time? Because every time you make a choice to do one of those activities, you're turning down an opportunity cost of doing something else at that same time, with that same money too. So there's priorities that get involved in the process. But I think the best thing you can do is figure out, what makes the learning experience at UST unique, what is valuable in that learning experience, and who should you expose that to. We found that, for example, in design schools, a lot of times good design projects can be stopped by people in finance or people in politics. So we started teaching design thinking classes to bankers and to politicians, not to convince them to join our side, but just so they could recognize quality when it came, thinking that in the future that would benefit everybody. So I think anything you can do to reward and remind people that learning for the sake of learning is valuable, that seeing the world through a different lens is always going to make you a wiser, smarter, more agile person, and also to capitalize on those things that are strengths. There are some universities that don't have campuses. There are some universities that don't have philosophy programs. There are some universities that don't have any full-time permanent teaching staff. So you guys actually have a lot of advantages over many of the universities in the world. Start to, maybe do a quick audit of that and say, what are we really good at? Or what do we take for granted? What do we know that we're good at, and what do we not know that we're actually good at or known for? And how can we go about sharing some of that? The other thing for building international collaborations, and I've noticed this most of my life actually, is that for anything like that to work beyond a transactional level, which is just writing checks and balancing checkbooks, or anything like that to actually work and take off, there's usually got to be one champion in each of the groups that actually wants it to work. So if you're doing study abroad, I've taken students, I'd be happy to do that here. I take students on a 2-week death march through Chicago. And so for 2 weeks, they have to walk for 16 hours a day and sketch and photograph and analyze and interview. And I teach them everything I can, everything that I know, and I get experts to help about the architecture, the food, and the music, which are 3 things that Chicago is famous for. And at the end of those 2 weeks, all the students say, I'm exhausted, I did so much. They make a mini documentary, and they say, now I feel like I know Chicago. And I said, once you know one city, then you can learn all of them, like languages, once you learn another one. So I think just thinking about what are those connections you already have, where are your alumni, and how can they contribute towards this idea that the university is a learning organization, not a profit-generating organization. I think those are the right kind of conversations to start having, because you actually find you're really good at a lot of things that you probably are blind to because you're so used to them. Or you invite an outsider to come in and ask and do some diagnostics, and you're like, oh, you guys do that, no one else does that. That's also really good to hear, too. Okay? Yeah.
Okay, thank you, sir. Now the floor is open for questions. So, like I said earlier, cite your name, then your academic institution, and your question. Of course, I agree with most of Sir Mical's answers. We also need to teach some administrators to treat people more than, of course, these people are not only shrimps or microorganisms in the laboratory, but they're also people with dignity. Any question, or anyone who wants to greet their parents?
Anyone want to go to Chicago?
Or want to advertise something?
was all clear.
Anyone who wants to be Sir Mical's tour guide later? Okay, sir, from architecture.
Hi there, Sir Mical. I'm Henry Herrera from the College of Architecture, assistant professor for almost 5 years, but I've been teaching for almost 10. It's a rather not a question, but I guess I want to ask you what you think about it. I have this project, my proposal actually, my research, is providing a proposed elevated walkway along the stretch of España Boulevard, which is in front of UST. This is from the Welcome Rotonda area up to the Quezon Boulevard, or a 2-kilometer stretch, elevated walkway. What's the purpose of this elevated walkway? The elevated walkway is for people to be walking on an easier pace, on a seamless travel above everything else, above the traffic.
Yeah.
I've asked people before I started the research actually, I've asked people coming from different areas. Some students say that when they are traveling the stretch in a public utility vehicle, it would take them approximately 10 minutes from that Welcome Rotonda area, the Rotonda area there in Quezon City, boundary of Quezon City and Manila, just going to UST or FEU. Now, if they go down the public utility vehicle, it would take them less time, although they'll be exhausted, but they'll be exercised in the process. And my take on it is that some of the vehicles, the culture of us Filipinos, for your information, I want to share this to you. The culture of some of the Filipinos is when they use the street, they think it's an extension of their house or an extension of their, if they're using public utility or private vehicles, they have this intention of me first. That kind of thinking, the discipline part. So, if I am a pedestrian and I can walk seamlessly without any obstructions, without any drivers who are raging to some pedestrians who are not minding their walking through the pedestrian crossings. So, what do you think is a good solution? Is this a good solution? Or I'm also thinking of a phase 2 of having it cross towards the light rail transit there in near Malacanang area, so that people, especially students and working in the working class, the middle working class, would have the option of walking towards their work or school without the hassles of being trapped in those traffic, the times of traffic, the heavy traffic scheme, which is usually in the mornings it will be at 7 to 10 o'clock, and in the evening or afternoon it will be around 4 or 5 o'clock up to 7 o'clock. So the travel time from one place to another is just near, but the time really, the distance is too near, but the time is taking too long. So what do you think of this kind of proposal that I've been proposing for the last 3 years now?
Well, I'm I'm thinking of examples where that has worked. So if I understand it correctly, part of the intention, part of the problem solving involves the idea of separating different types of movement and creating more accessibility. If that's the case, some constraints and some possibilities to think about, because without having as thorough knowledge, I would just say that if I understand the intentions correctly, there's probably one or more solutions that could work, but often it will cause a bit of a decision-making process over priorities. I'll explain what I mean in a second. So one example I can think of where that works really well is the very famous example that all of the Australian students loved when we went to New York, which is the High Line project. So we had a series of train tracks elevated in New York City that were decommissioned, and so that, they're just up in the air. And this, what are we going to do with these things? And it's actually kind of expensive to tear them down. And one option was, rip them out and replace them with a shopping mall. That'll make money. But someone said, actually, there's not a lot of green space in New York. There used to be more. Could we turn that into a park? And so they had a competition, and the design has been built. And it's relatively short. The students walked in about 10, 15 minutes. But they designed it in such a way that, there's some historical parts that show the different types of grasses and plants that used to grow in New York. They have some areas with benches. They have some with flyways, so you can go into the neighboring buildings. There's multiple ways up and multiple ways down. So one model is to say the one way to create circulation is to put destinations or events along the circulation, so it's not simply a circulation corridor. So that's and swerve and bob and weave through the city. And that could be actually quite sculptural, and that could also work with, obviously some of the constraints. I'm thinking in New Zealand, we had limits, minimum limits for bridging streets because of fire truck egress, airplanes. We couldn't even project images onto buildings because it created confusion to pilots. So there's a whole bunch of constraints the moment you cross the street that you don't have if you're running with the grain of the street in parallel, or if you're occupying some other spaces. So I think one of the things to think about too is that we mentioned before, historically in mobility studies, different degrees of movement actually were class markers or indicated your prosperity or access to power resources. So the faster you can move through a space, in principle, the more important you are. Is it the case that people that are coming directly to the university should have more direct access than someone who's making a living on the sidewalk? If the case is yes, then you design it in such a way that works. It's been my experience going to bus and train stations in Mexico that even the skinny little stairs and the walkways connecting get crowded within 2 weeks of being built with people selling lotto tickets, luchador masks, chips, anything they can think of, because they're like, there's the traffic flow, so that's my income source. And we also know from studies of highway infrastructures that when you widen a highway and create more accessibility, it actually just brings more traffic. So it's a game of no returns, that the more highways you build, the more they get filled, and you can go ad infinitum. And there's some examples of American cities where that's been a disaster too. So I think for me that the fundamental challenges of all those different conditions, because I've always been curious about who owns the sidewalks in Manila, right? That was one of the first questions that asked me. It's like, I see vehicles on there, I see families on there, I see cribs on there, I see businesses on there, I see injured people on there, I see almost everything happening on the sidewalks. And I thought, this is more democratic than an elevator. This is fascinating. And then I think, what happens if I was in a wheelchair? Or what happens if it was an emergency? So I understand that impulse too. And I'm wondering, is there a way to think of it as, if you call it a pedestrian pathway, it becomes that. And I'm thinking of cases in cold places like Chicago that once you pull people off the ground plane and ask them to walk, they very rarely will do it unless it's a gradual slope that doesn't look hard and they can see the destination. Otherwise, they're worried that they might get mugged or something. I don't know if that would happen here. So in some ways, it's got to be very gentle and it's got to be very easy for people to create the suction to get people to start moving on it. And if they can see a clear destination, I think that's also another thing to think about too. So, conceptually it's a fascinating project, and I know that fire trucks actually take up a lot more space than you think, and utility access and stuff. So at a technical level, intervening in the city is always contested, because everyone will say, well, you're cutting off the sunlight to my garden and my condo balcony, and my tomato plants will die, so you're an evil person, so I'm going to block your project. And I've seen that happen in Chicago, where it goes all the way up to the judges to sort out who has access to sunlight or other things too. So I think, one thing I would recommend is, if you've probably done this, but I would say have a whole bunch of students work on designing it, debugging it, and playing devil's advocate and say, why wouldn't you use it or why won't it work? So you have a more robust design. Another thing that I hinted at is called co-design. Work with the people in the neighborhoods and say, this is what we think we're doing. Because when I worked for Chicago Parks District, even when we were designing little bathhouses for the beaches, we had to go to all the community neighborhoods and get them to approve the designs, which actually, we didn't design much because it was all by code, certain height for the water fountain, certain number of stalls. There was very little design, but we still had to go out and convince all of the different neighborhoods that this is a good design. We actually had very little design flexibility, but we had a legal obligation to make sure that no community felt disadvantaged, that they were getting a worse bathhouse, or that they hadn't been heard and been able, and many of the designs we took back and redid based on community feedback. So that's a political argument, and that's saying besides the technical issues and the aesthetic issues, which I've highlighted, the third one would be the political. If you can get enough people around you in that neighborhood saying, we want this, then you're in much safer grounds than being seen as an intervening developer trying to push something on people. Because people over centuries have become very suspicious and almost defensive about that. The first reaction is, why here? Right? It's called NIMBYism, not in my backyard. And it's like, oh, you have to put the power plant somewhere else. Oh, you have to put the shelter for abused women somewhere else. Oh, you have to put the car park somewhere else. Because they don't want it in their backyards. But if you can convince people like the High Line, I'm sure the politics behind that was quite dramatic too. But once people started to see what the result would be and how much it would benefit the neighborhood, people said, well, let's make it bigger. Right? So I'm saying there's a technical solution, there's an aesthetic solution, and there's a political solution. And if you're like me, your architectural education taught you mostly about the aesthetic and a little bit about the technical and nothing about the political. And that's where you learn the hard way when you practice. Okay?
Well noted, sir. Thank you.
Any more questions?
Good afternoon, Professor Mical. I'm Jovito Carino from the Department of Philosophy. My question is this. I think our problem here in the Philippines, not only in Manila, is that we have really an excess of nomadic spaces. We dramatize to a T Deleuze's idea of a nomadic space. You have seen Plaza Miranda, the space where practically everyone intersects.
I have a fantasy that you could buy anything there if you
Yes. Quiapo, not only Plaza Miranda, but the entire Quiapo, the area is a cross-section of Islam, Catholicism, commerce, secularism, pedestrian, vehicular movement, etc., etc. As an observer looking in, I'd like to know whether that excess of nomadic space, which Deleuze romanticizes so much, is actually a thing that we must preserve, or should we temper it rather with a bit of geometry?
Okay. Well, the geometry usually lines up with the striated, but it's an interesting question because as a phenomena, it is not common in many places in the world, although, as you said, it might be quite common in the Philippines. I'm wondering about the domestic space, and our house is organized the same way, where people can just move through each other's rooms without asking permission, and maybe that's the case, or your neighbors will just put up an addition and block out your sunlight without checking with you. Maybe that's the case. One quick reaction, I could use the it's a logical fallacy, but I could say the straw man argument and say, well, when I was in China, I was told to be careful when you cross the streets. They record all of your behaviors and movements, and they can recognize you by your walk, not just your face. And that if you cut across the street before the light changes, they keep track, and if you do that enough times, they will ask you to leave. as a high, I don't know if the students were trying to scare me when they told me that, if it was true, but implicit in that was that there was a highly mechanized, efficient way to move through space, and in those spaces where there was high traffic, it was regulated and recorded. And I'm thinking that, and if it is the case that nomadism or nomadology, which actually was, my reading had more to do with a creative science of doing new things with old things, to put it in a simple way. The occupation and the use of public space in the public realm is increasingly a focus of scholarship in some of the North American and European contexts, precisely because those spaces, and I'm thinking, for example, when I was in Prague, they said you can only paint your door, I think, 4 different colors legally, because they want to preserve the kitschy quality for tourism. That a lot of the so-called public spaces are increasingly being privatized, but giving the appearance of being public spaces, shopping malls being one example, but increasingly, parks that are being gated, for example, and the communities can't access them. And to think about, it raises a much larger question, which for me is fascinating because my architectural tools don't tell me how to answer that, is how do you design space for democracy? Because democracy means you have to accommodate people who don't cook like you, talk like you, or think like you in the space that you have to somehow share and negotiate. And the negotiation process is, I've been learning how to cross the street quickly now by nodding at people as they march across without slowing down and stuff. And picking up those subtle social clues about how you actually move through space, what's acceptable distance between things, when to anticipate people jumping the lights. It might be romanticizing it, but it seems like there is a oversaturation of functions within those public spaces, which shows a certain confidence of people to know that I will not go to jail if I do this, or it's okay if I bump into someone who thinks or acts or smells differently than I do. And for me, that actually gives me a bit of hope, because those spaces are disappearing in a lot of parts of the world, too. And so you might see it as messy or disorganized or a strain on the infrastructure, but historically, public spaces have done that. And a lot of governments will recognize that the public realm needs to be maintained financially as well as aesthetically. And we want to also be careful about the fact that it's very possible, and I can think of plenty of examples, you can find them, where a public space has been, quote, renovated, and then it gives us such strong signals that, either poor people, minorities, people of certain groups do not feel comfortable or welcome in that space. So in the process of sanitizing public spaces, there is a danger that they become exclusive, even though they might have open, porous boundaries. The actual coding of the materials, the proportions, religious imagery, things of this nature, might make them prohibitive spaces. So I guess the fundamental challenge, and this is where I said I'm intrigued by, is how much disorder can the people of Manila put up with? And compared to other countries, a heck of a lot. And again, as an outsider, that's actually a good thing relative to some other. And you might fantasize about, I wish it was more like Los Angeles. And I'm like, no, you don't want policemen in every corner who are very aggressive and can, clean out, quote, undesirable people quickly. You don't want to have a situation where your ability to move from one space to another, you have to negotiate where all the danger zones are and work around it. You don't want to be in a space where you feel like if you go there, you may not come back. I mean, the public realm is supposed to be that. It's supposed to be welcoming. And the fact that, and I'm not doing it to romanticize it, but I should point out that this is actually probably the best of all worlds, to use a Leibniz quote, right? That if you've got everybody feeling that they can come and do whatever they want in those public spaces, they can pray, they can sell, they can steal, they can talk to tourists, all those things, maybe the same person does all those things in the same hour. And that's actually, in some circles, would be seen as a desirable goal, as people work to make their public spaces more public again, like they remember their being. But even if you go back to the ancient Greeks, and who got to be in the open spaces and what they're allowed to discuss, the policing has always been there. And it's the question of how much difference, how much resistance, how much, diversity are you willing to tolerate? At a meta level, it's saying, how resilient is the public realm? And it seems like it's always pushed to the point of breaking infrastructurally, but people still get up each morning and get dressed and go there and hope for a better day. So I don't think it's as bad as it might sound. As an architect, you want to script every single grout between every floor tile and coordinate all the people's movements, so it's a beautifully mechanized system. But fortunately, people don't obey architects. They do what they want to do. And intellectually, that's kind of intriguing too, because they do it differently in different places, often for different reasons too. I think, that would be an interesting project to look at, would be to say, You know, who are the novelists, the poets, and the filmmakers who have put us in that context and made us understand what it feels like to be in a democratic space, as opposed to looking at it as photographers and saying, look at this mess, look at this disorder, look at this. And to reassert the subjectivity and that experience of the space, as opposed to the image or the aesthetic image of the space in a condition of disrepair or overuse. That's where I would turn. I would say, who are the novelists who put us there and made us want to go there?
Of course, Quiapo is a very good place. Not only the spaces are nomadic, but also the people. Some of them in the morning are fortune tellers, then in the evening they become criminals or prostitutes. Then the other day they will become the Nazarene devotees. Then the next day, perhaps a teacher. Any other question?
I'm Cecilia May Villanueva. I'm from the College of Architecture, and my question is about our nomadic curriculum system. We recently changed to having the senior high school. Before we only had until grade 10, now we have until grade 12. And we've also changed our architecture curriculum. Before, in our studio for the freshman architecture, we focused mainly on personal space and residential design. Now our first year design studios are looking into how we view form from the outside. We're looking into classical proportions. I'd like to know, how do you have your curriculum in your college for the freshmen? Do you also go in first into the personal space, or do you jump immediately also into how we view it as a form and look at classical proportions?
Yeah. Well, I've been at many universities, so I'm just going to give a couple of quick snapshots so you realize there's some diversity, and there's a big debate about, the first year is seen as the hardest to teach as well as to be a student. So it gets a lot of attention in curriculum discussions. When I was at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute, they would have the students go out and identify a commonly disposed of article that was supposed to be recyclable, like soda pop or the plastic ties for trash bags or something. They would have them find something that was intended and designed and manufactured to be recyclable, but wasn't often being recycled, and then to compile as much of that. So it was collecting, remnants, and they would sit them on their desk, and then they would have them find different ways to connect those individual pieces. So they would take a soda bottle, cut the bottoms off, and get the round disc, and then try to figure out how to attach them to other round discs. So it became a very material exercise of how do you take something that is becoming waste, that shouldn't be waste, and how do you turn it into a component, and how do you assemble those components? So it's already building in an automated model of architecture. It has nothing to do with subjectivity or public realm. And then from that process of finding ways without glue to connect things, then how do you take those connections and make it into a surface? And then how do you make the surface wrap around a space? Then how do you draw that surface? And then how do you digitally model that surface? That was the first semester. So what the students learned was the ethos of recycling. They learned processes of assemblage. They learned hand drawing and digital photography, and then they learned digital representation. And then they would take the module and then repeat it and use software like Rhino and Grasshopper to understand that's the way you make buildings. So what they did in that process, which was fascinating to me, was they were disavowing subjectivity. They made it more about technical problem solving. There was very little history or culture or context for those things, and it simply was, repurposing or upcycling things in the manufacturing chain and thinking about how you could use that to create a cellular approach towards architecture. So, of course, by the second year, all the projects looked like a variation of that. When I was at Georgia Tech, they had one semester, it was trimesters. The first trimester was understanding classical proportions in relationship to the body. And so people would learn how to proportion and draw, the head is 1/7 of the body, and learn all these rules of thumb and how those translated into the classical canons, and then do diagrams and analytiques, a Beaux-Arts technique of representation to show that understanding. And then they say, okay, that system is closed to us now. We only use that for banks. Let's jump into the modern. So the next semester was, all right, let's study Adolphe Loos and Le Corbusier and how they assemble and construct volumes and Corbusier modular. So it was like a variation of the classical body and space epistemic center. And then the third semester was, okay, let's design something in the park that people can use. And then that was a bit disruptive too, at least the semester we did it. Our first semester was very much a casual thing about just start drawing something in your environment and then draw what's next to it and let's draw. And they were trying to teach us to open our eyes. And I heard about a very interesting project that I think someone in London did, where the first semester was design the desk that you want to do drawings on. And design it, draw it, and build it at 1-to-1. So your first week you built your own drafting table. And I said, okay, next week we're going to work at 1-to-2. Design the space around your drafting table and then draw that at 1-to-2. Then the next week, go to 1-to-4 and design how the sunlight comes in. And then by the end of the semester, they were at 1-to-104.8 or something. They just kept doubling it every week until they had designed a whole city. And that's like the Eames film, The Power of 10. What they found in these different debates, and I remember Massimo Scolari taught neoclassical techniques at the GSD too. What they found was, in conversations with people, having a discipline and learning a method in the first year was much more beneficial than just having garden variety roaming, or nomads in a sense. Because what happens is, once the discipline's there, and think like a musician, once the discipline is there, you can change your language. You can even change your instrument. And this was a common debate at the first year design things. If the discipline's not there, it's really hard to add it in the 4th or 5th year when they need it the most. And so the rule of thumb they used to tell us is just have them learn one thing really, really well. And go for depth, because a lot of the students, I had a colleague in Canada who would lock students in the studio and say, you're going to draw for 6 hours. No mobile phones, no bathrooms, no water. You're here to draw for 6 hours. And students would be in tears. And he's like, no, 6 hours is half of a workday in an office. If you can't hold a thought or do a drawing for 6 hours, and it's a type of corporal torture. But his argument was the one thing you guys don't have in high school is focus, and I'm going to teach you focus, which they did. And they'd all thank him 10 years later, but they wanted to sue him while they were in the class too. So like I said, first year is the hardest. It's the hardest to adjust, because in every country I've talked to, the high school systems do not prepare students to study architecture when they come into an architecture school. The architecture schools are constantly being buffeted by the shifting pedagogies of high school and the shifting demands of the profession. So they've got 2 harsh masters they have to serve. And then the architecture schools are also innovating. You can't just, if you've taught the same studio for 2 years, you'll vary it out of boredom the 3rd year, because you need that variety to keep going. And I think my experiences in teaching first years too is bringing in a sense of discipline and rigor. It sounds antithetical, so that they have the freedom to improvise. And again, that's a musical argument too. The photographers, Hassan and others who worked on doing street photography, they said, you've got to learn your fundamentals. You've got to learn the ISO and the apertures, and you've got to learn how to work the camera. Otherwise, nothing will come. Right? And the same thing with musical instruments. You learn the scales. And it's not very disciplinary, and when I went through that, I hated it. Right? So I think the real challenge is, how do you build a disciplinary focus and do it in a way that doesn't come across as corporeal, punitive, or militaristic? Because that's usually the default setting, is you're going to learn this whether you like it or not. And I don't think students are responding as well to that. I didn't like that too. And so maybe that's the question. How do you pose it as a series of enigmas or puzzles, so that the discipline comes, but also people are empowered to search and find answers for themselves? But like I said, we could talk for hours. First year is really hard. It's hard. Everybody at the end of a first year studio looks exhausted. The teachers are in tears. The students are in tears. Usually the parents are in tears when they hear about it. It's a hard one.
I think we can now proceed to the next part of the program to deliver the closing remarks. And I'll call the Director of the Research Center for Culture, Arts and Humanities, Professor Joyce Ayona.
Thomas Mical, Dr. Paolo Bolaños, Chair of the Department of Philosophy. Our members of the department from the Department of Philosophy and Department and College of Architecture, and I saw some faculty members from the Department of Literature a while ago. Congratulations on this event. I thank you, Professor Mical, for coming over and delivering your lecture on Nomad Science into Knowledge Assemblages. Actually, this is one of the interdisciplinary engagements that the center has been privileged enough to sponsor. When we think of knowledge assemblages, we're thinking of the holism, the interdisciplinarity of the center and the disciplines in the center. It used to be the College of Art, Architecture and Fine Arts, and then I think sometime in the 90s they split it into two, and then now in this call for interdisciplinarity, the separation may be a thing of the past and maybe summoned back to cooperation and collaboration, not only with the fine arts but also with philosophy, literature, and music perhaps, since Professor Cecilia May Villanueva is looking into the study of sound, right? And perhaps sound occupies space too, no? Like music. I'm sorry for coming in late. I caught the perhaps the second half of the lecture, and I heard about the structures of thought that Professor Mical was talking about, and I think this is exactly what the research center is aiming at. Not only at coming up with professions like perhaps the architecture profession or the design profession, but also for us to solidify into disciplines. So this is a very important lecture. It pushes us to theorize, to organize our concepts into somehow to make us reflective or even reflexive. And what can be more, where can it be more fertile than in architecture, which is a functional art. Now you use it, and now you can reflect upon it. You can theorize on not only the structure, but the use of space, or the movement, the mobility, the nomadism, and others. The study of space is very important to the disciplines in the RCCA. Ambient poetics, some of our researchers in literature are into ambient poetics, especially ecology and literature, and also diasporic communication. Some of our researchers are into diasporic communication. But of course, they are talking more of the movement of humans vis-a-vis the movement of structures or into structures. So I'm glad that you brought up design as research, because this is exactly the problem of the College of Architecture. The undergrad is about design and about form. The master's level may be also about that too, but perhaps now that we are putting up a Ph.D. in architecture, we can go into theorizing and thinking about all of these concepts that Professor Mical has laid out for us this afternoon. When we think of postmodernism, the incursion of postmodernism, it's not really so much that did not really take place in literature nor in the other art forms, but in architecture. Primarily because of the very functionality of the art form. That you apply it first and then you think about it. You are already living it, and then you reflect upon it. So in RCCA, we have the Research Center for Culture, Arts and Humanities, we have 2 tracks for architecture. One is on heritage research, the built heritage. We have architect Alcaraz and architect Noche working on that. And of course, the majority of them are working on urban design and community planning. So it cannot only be urban design, we need to engage the community. So architect Henry is talking about how the community of Sampaloc is engaged here, and the sound research of architect Cecil, architect Roots, ecological eco-architecture, and so on and so forth. Also, architect Malaga was here, the vegetation within the campus. So, but we also have space scholars, or mobility scholars in the other disciplines, like Loden Mark de Camora, who was, I think, no longer around, talking about reciting the kitchen in the works of Nicoquin. Both of your interests, which are food and space, may be found in the work of Professor Loden Mark de Camora. Also, we have other members of the faculty, like they are into trauma studies, and so what Professor Raniel Reyes mentioned a while ago about artifact versus cultural memory. So you have memories associated in places like Quiapo or Intramuros. I think this is a very good opportunity for us to indigenize our study of nomadism and mobility. The anthropologists have made a headway, like Cobars, sa loob at labas. That's why we are overtaking the pedestrian lanes, because we have such a weird sense of public space. Perhaps because historically we have always been marginalized, So we are living outside Intramuros. We are part of Extramuros. So we can perhaps liberate our study of space and put some colonial poetics into that. And this is a very good opportunity through the mentoring that Professor Mical may do for our researchers. I'm very happy to listen to this lecture and this conversation. What Professor Mical has discussed this afternoon will serve as a challenge to our research agenda, particular to architecture, design, and other fields like philosophy, literature, and media studies. Space, nomadism, mobilities, and other concepts may be sites where we can collaborate or engage in an interdisciplinary manner, where we formerly thought of boundaries, borders, territories. We can reimagine our research projects into sites where we can explore the nomad science as a point of entry to innovation. As much as it is a fascination for the old, its precursor, and as assemblages of knowledge that we have only imagined before within the confines of our rigid disciplines, but now we can summon to open the ground for possibilities that Professor Mical has articulated so well and comprehensively. Thank you for attending this lecture. Thank you to the Philippine Philo Department for organizing the event, for the architecture professors for the response, Professor Mical for the sharing, and I warmly invite the faculty and guests to a simple reception at the RCCA office. Good afternoon once again, and thank you.
Thank you.